All right, so chapter 14 is the spinal cord. And as I said, today we're focusing on the conduction pathways and reflexes. So this is more of like the physiology part of the spinal cord. There's a whole bunch of anatomy, as I said before, that we've covered in last lab and then this lab today. And this is more of the physiology part. Now, I do want to mention that there are some areas in the spinal cord chapter, if you read the book, where I'm not going to go into as much detail. So some of the naming all the different pathways and tracks, the motor and sensory ones, I don't think you need to memorize that. Hopefully you'll be able to look it up, or you'll take another like neurophysiology class if you are going to go into some sort of neurology, and you'll talk about it then. So I'm going to introduce them to you, but I'm not going to ask you to memorize them like as specifically. So if you notice, the PowerPoint slides are not quite as detailed as the book is, and that's just because we're not going to go into quite as much detail. Now, if you are going to go into neurology, you'll probably need to know them, but if you're not, you may not. We're going to kind of go over the basics. So the major functions of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. And remember, the spinal nerves are all the nerves that come out from each spinal cord segment, and you have 31 pairs. It is the structural and functional link between the brain and the rest of the body, right? So the spinal cord is going to start at the medulla oblongata. So it's the continuation of that medulla oblongata, and it comes all the way down, and it's going to end, the spinal cord proper is going to end at that conus medullaris at around the L1, L2 level. And so those nerves, the 31 pairs, are going to come out, and they're going to be carrying both sensory and motor fibers. And those sensory motor fibers are going to, the sensory fibers are going to sense things from the peripheral nervous system and bring them back to the spinal cord. The motor nerves are going to bring motor impulses from the spinal cord and send them out to the, effectors like skeletal muscles and glands, or smooth muscles. And so then once it gets to the spinal cord is going to then have some ascending tracks, so sensory tracks that go up towards the brain, or motor tracks that come down from the brain. Then we have spinal reflexes, and these spinal reflexes are going to kind of be the last half that we'll talk about today. And these are responses that do not involve the brain. They go straight to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord kind of has interneurons here that can make that decision. And then they're going to have a fast reaction to that stimulus. They're going to send that information right back out. So remember, when we get to the spinal reflexes, that the brain is not required for these spinal reflexes. So it's a quick review of some of the important anatomy of the spinal cord. So if you haven't watched the anatomy video from lab last week, make sure you go ahead and do that. That'll be helpful. But here's our spinal cord, and this is going to be a transverse section through the spinal cord. And so this on the interior is the gray matter, and then the exterior is going to be the white matter. Remember, the gray matter is made up of what? Cell bodies and dendrites and unmyelinated axons, whereas the white matter is made up of myelinated axons. And so mostly the cell bodies and things are going to be in this gray matter. And you've got some short little unmyelinated axons here too. So we can see here that this is going to be the posterior area. So we've got the little groove is the posterior median sulcus, and then we have the posterior nerve root, and everything on the posterior area is sensory. So this nerve root here is going to carry sensory information that's coming up, and then cell bodies of these sensory neurons are going to be in the posterior root ganglion. So remember that I want you guys to know, and there will be some questions on the test, like where are the cell bodies of the sensory neurons located? Where are the cell bodies of the motor neurons located? Where are the cell bodies of the autonomic motor neurons located? Where are the cell bodies of the interneurons located? So this is a really important picture to make sure that you can label and understand and answer questions like that. So we've got the cell bodies of our sensory neurons are in this dorsal root ganglion. The cell bodies of our interneurons are in this dorsal horn of the gray matter. The cell bodies of our autonomic motor neurons are in the lateral horn, and the cell bodies of the somatic motor neurons are in the anterior horns. So these two are going to go out the motor root, or the anterior root. And then the anterior and posterior roots are going to join together to form the spinal nerve. Now that's all the gray matter, and it's important to know all of this. But we do also need to talk about the white matter. And so we'll get to the white matter in just a little bit too. Remember, the white matter are the axons. And these axons are going to be going either up towards the brain or down towards the body, depending on if they're sensory or motor tracks. So which one are going up towards the brain? The sensory tracks, right? The sensory tracks are ascending tracks or afferent tracks, whereas the motor tracks are going to be descending tracks or efferent tracks. Now, remember that we call these funiculuses. So the areas of white matter with a bunch of tracks in them. So this is the posterior funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and the anterior funiculus. And then this opening here, this is going to be the white commissure or the anterior white commissure. And then this guy right here is the gray commissure, and that's going to connect the left and the right gray matters together. Now the hole in the middle is the central canal, and that is one of the areas that contains the CSF. And we talked a little bit about the meninges in the lab last week. And so the meninges, once again, are similar to the meninges of the brain, and this cerebrospinal fluid is going to be flowing within the subarachnoid space of the meninges. Now the meninges is important. We talked a little bit about epidurals and spinal anesthesia and CSF. So those could be questions like clinical wise on the exam. So as I said before, we've got the cell bodies and everything that are sitting in the gray matter, and we wanted to know where those cell bodies were in the gray matter. And then the white matter are made of these tracks of axons that are going either up the spinal cord or down the spinal cord. And so we can see that the white matter is made of these bunch of different tracks. And we have these different sections or different segments of pathways. Now, all these names here, I'm going to mention some of these names, but I'm not going to have you memorize these pathways. Now, I do, if you needed to know them, you have your textbook, you can look them up, you know, further in your career, or if you take a neurophysiology class, you are probably going to have to memorize them then. But for this class, I'll be okay if you just are familiar with them and you understand the basics. So all the ones that are kind of blue tinged, these are sensory tracks. So sensory tracks are going to be moving up towards the brain. All the ones that are red tinged or orangey are going to be motor tracks, and they're moving down towards the brain. So if you notice, just like we said the posterior before, the posterior area is mostly sensory. And so, or pretty much all sensory in this posterior funiculus of the white matter. But both the anterior and the lateral are mixed. So the lateral is pretty mixed. The anterior is mostly motor, but there are a couple little sensory tracks in there. So posterior is pretty much all sensory. So now we're going to talk about the general differences between a sensory and motor pathway and the general features that are common to both of them. So remember, we said these spinal pathways, these are going to be, we're talking about these things right here. We're talking about the pathways that these myelinated axons are taking up and down the spinal cord. We have sensory pathways or ascending pathways that are going to ascend and go up towards the brain, right? Because we have information coming from our skin and going all the way down. It's going to go up here and up towards the brain. Those are sensory. Then we have motor pathways that are going to start from our primary motor cortex, if it's a somatic motor cortex, and then it's going to go all the way down to the spinal cord and go down to like your arm or whatever and go out to your muscles. So those are descending pathways. So they share some common characteristics. So they're both pathways, right? Pathways are paired. So you have a left and a right side of your brain, a left and a right side of your body, a left and a right arm. You also have a left and a right side of the spinal cord. So you're going to have paired pathways. You'll have left and right tracks that are mirrored on either side of the spinal cord. In general, the axons, the myelinated axons, are in the spinal cord tracks, right? They're going to be in the white matter. Whereas the cell bodies, right, because the cell bodies would be part of gray matter. So tracks are going to be someone asked in chat, are pathways and tracks the same? And so the tracks are going to be what we call a bundle of myelinated axons within the central nervous system. So like within the spinal cord. But the pathway in general is going to include some peripheral nerves and then go up to the spinal cord. So the pathway is kind of includes some of the peripheral nerves outside, and then it also includes the tracks in the spinal cord. So it kind of encompasses both of those. The cell bodies are generally, they're non-myelinated, so they're part of the gray matter, and they're found either in the ganglia, the gray horns of the spinal cord, or sometimes they're all the way up in the brain, right? Each pathway is made of a chain of 2 or more neurons. And so I'll talk to you about sensory pathways, like the general representative sensory pathway and a general representative motor pathway. And there are at least 2 neurons. Sensory pathways usually have 3. And then most pathways decussate, or they cross. So just think this means cross. Most pathways cross. So the axons cross the midline. So the brain processes information from the contralateral side. So the word contralateral means the opposite side. I know that it seems like we should just say opposite and we should just say cross instead of decusate. So it can be a little confusing, but try to keep this new terminology and just get those words into your head. But so it's going to be important. So remember that the left side of the brain in general is going to control the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain in general is going to control the left side of the body. So uncrossed pathways, there are some pathways that don't cross, and those are going to work on the ipsilateral side of the body. And ipsilateral means same side, so the same side of the body. So I think this will make a little bit more sense once I start showing you some pictures of what the pathways are. I know they can be a little bit confusing sometimes. So we're going to start with sensory pathways, right? Remember, are sensory pathways ascending or descending? So they go up to the brain or down towards the muscles? They're ascending. They are going to go up to the brain. So they have sensory input that is transmitted from your general sense receptors up through the spinal cord, and then it's going to go up to the brain. Did someone have a question? All right, so we have two different categories of sensory receptors. And remember, we've mentioned these before, but we have somatic senses. And our somatic senses are going to be, and we're talking about general senses right now, not the special senses like vision and smell and taste. And we'll get to those in chapter 16. But for now, we'll talk more about the parietal lobe stuff, where we're talking about pain, pressure, temperature, and touch. So with our general senses, we have two different types. So we have got one that you are conscious of. You are consciously aware of feeling these things. That's like pain, pressure, temperature, touch, these tactile receptors. And then a special type called proprioceptors. And proprioceptors are going to be found like in your tendons and your muscles and your joints, and they tell your body if how your joints, if they're flexed or extended, and where your body is in space. So even if you close your eyes, you can touch your nose, you can, touch your hair, if your arms are extended or flexed. And so these you're aware of. But then we also have visceral sensory receptors. And these visceral sensory receptors are also important, but they carry information that we are not consciously aware of. So things like how much stretch is in your arteries, how many, what is the, what is your blood pressure, what is your blood sugar, different things like that. That your reflex centers in your brainstem know this, but consciously it never makes it to our cerebral cortex, so we don't consciously know that. So in this class, or in this part of the lecture, we're going to focus a little bit more on the somatic sensory pathways. Those somatic sensory pathways carry signals from the skin, the muscles, and the joint, things that we feel more often. And your viscerosensory pathways generally carry signals from the viscera. Like I said before, blood pressure, things like that. And so these sensory pathways are going to rely on a series of, in general, 3 different neurons. And so if you watch the Ed puzzle, it talked about these 3 neurons. The Ed puzzle was mostly on sensory pathways. And so the primary or first order neuron is going to be the one that's the sensory receptor. So it is the receptor somewhere. So you have the Pacinian corpuscle or the Mesner's corpuscle that we talked about in the integumentary system. It has this peripheral ending, meaning that it's going to it has a sensory receptor somewhere in the skin or the muscles. The cell body is going to be in the posterior root ganglion. So in here, let's see. There's a good picture all the way down here, this part. So you've got this primary neuron right here is located, we're going to have the receptor out here somewhere. Then the primary neuron has the cell body that's located in the posterior root ganglion. So it's going to be that first one. So all of this is a nerve right here. So this isn't the tract yet. This is a nerve, but it's part of the pathway. Then we're going to have this portion here is going to go up to the spinal cord. And depending on what type of pathway, it either might go straight here and synapse somewhere in this gray matter, and then cross and then go back up, or it's going to go through here and the axon is going to go up. It's going to ascend at some level in the spinal cord until it synapses somewhere else in the gray matter or maybe even in the brainstem. So that's the primary neuron. And so our primary motor neuron, primary sensory neuron or first order neuron is going to have the cell body in the posterior root ganglion, and the axon is going to lead to the secondary neuron. Now, the secondary neuron is an interneuron, so it's going to be somewhere in the central nervous system. It's going to receive the primary input, and it's going to extend to the tertiary neuron. So it's like the middle neuron in this chain. Usually it's going to go to the thalamus, because remember that the thalamus is the sensory sorting area, so almost all of our sensory signals are going to go through the thalamus at any time. The cerebellum is also important. Remember, we said the cerebellum also receives input from your proprioceptors and things to see and help make you smooth and graceful. So sometimes the secondary neuron goes straight to the cerebellum. And in those cases, those spinocerebellar tracts, there's only two, but most of them we have three. And then finally, the tertiary or third order neuron usually starts in the thalamus, and then it's going to go up to the somatosensory cortex of the primary lobe, right, of the parietal lobe. And this is going to be in the case of all of the those general senses that we're consciously aware of. So touch, temperature, pressure, pain, things like that. So I'm going to go through a couple of example tracks. As I said, these example tracks, I want you to know specifically, like this slide is important. And the next slide, I want you to know the general stuff. I'm not going to ask a lot of specifics about these names, but I do want to give you, like, these are some examples to know. So this first one is the posterior funiculus medial lemniscal pathway. And it's going to come back up here in this posterior funiculus area, and this is going to be in, these tracks are going to be running in that posterior funiculus of the white matter of the spinal cord. So this is going to carry signals about proprioception, touch, pressure, and vibration, and there's a 3-neuron chain. So our primary one is going to be, we have, different sensory receptors in the skin. Then it's going to come up here to the spinal cord. The cell body is in the posterior root ganglion. Then it's going to relay signals from the skin. It's going to go through here, and it's going to, this axon is going to go up that posterior funiculus, up those tracks. And it's then going to synapse in the brainstem. And so there are these little nuclei in the brainstem that it's going to synapse in. And then it's going to, the secondary neuron is the one that's going to cross midline. So you can see the secondary neuron right here, and the brainstem crosses midline, and then it's going to continue up into the thalamus. So we start from the medulla and then go up to the thalamus, and that's the secondary neuron. And then the tertiary neuron is going to go from the thalamus up to the primary somatosensory cortex in that postcentral gyrus, so that we can become aware of that. So this is a good example of a 3-neuron chain that's carrying that somatosensory information up to the parietal lobe. And remember, we talked about how that primary somatosensory cortex has the the sensory homunculus. And so it's going to receive, different parts of this cortex will receive information from different parts of your body. So that's one example. And we can see that this is going to cross midline. And when it crosses midline, then that's why we have the information from the left side of the body going up to, the right side of the body going up to the left side of the body going up to the right side of the brain. The opposite. Oh, no. I touched a button on the mouse. So let's continue again. All right, so the next pathway we'll talk about, and once again, this is another example. I'm not going to ask you to like write out all exactly where these pathways are, because I think that's a little bit complicated. But the next one is called the anterolateral pathway. This is going to also relay some of those somatosensory things. So crude touch, pressure, pain, and temperature with a 3-neuron chain again, so 3 neurons. So the primary neuron, once again, is going to have the sensory receptor somewhere in the skin. And then it's going to send the information from the skin to the spinal cord. The cell body is in the posterior root ganglion, and it's going to go up here and synapse. But see, this time, instead of going up a little bit and synapsing in the brainstem, it's going to synapse with the secondary neuron at sort of that same level. And so the secondary neuron is then going to cross midline at the gray commissure. So just like the other one crossed midline up in the medulla, this one crosses midline here. So there's usually going to be a crossing. And then it's going to send these information up here. There's the anterior spinal thalamic tract or the lateral spinal thalamic tract. Once again, you don't need to necessarily remember these tracks, but this is just a good example. And then we're going to go up to the thalamus again. As I said, a lot of these secondary neurons are going to end in the thalamus because that thalamus is that sensory sorting area. And then finally, the tertiary neuron is going to be similar to the previous tract where it starts in the thalamus and it ends in the primary somatosensory cortex. All right, so once again, it's a 3-neuron chain. Primary neuron has the receptor, the secondary neuron is an interneuron, and it usually ends in the thalamus, and the tertiary neuron is going to start in the thalamus and go up to that primary somatosensory cortex. And these are all for those somatic general senses. Now, this last one is called the spinocerebellar pathway. This is like the exception to the rule. And as I said before, the cerebellum needs to get some information too, because the cerebellum has to figure out how the body is moving and, help integrate and do course corrections for making sure that the body stays moving gracefully and making sure that your balance is okay. So we're going to send our proprioceptive information to the cerebellum. And so this is going to be information about how our body is moving, where our body parts are in space. And it can check this against the blueprint that our motor cortex sent to the cerebellum to say, I told you we were going to be walking across the room. And then the cerebellum can check and see if the body walked across the room and if we need to make any corrections. So for this one, it's a 2-neuron chain. So this is kind of like the exception to the rule, where once again, the primary neuron is going to have these receptors, these sensory receptors in joints, muscles, and tendons in the periphery. It's going to go up here to the spinal cord, and the cell body is in the it's in the dorsal root ganglion. And then it's going to come here and synapse. And so it's going to synapse here. Some of them are going to be contralateral, some of them cross, some of them actually remain ipsilateral. So like this one here remains ipsilateral, this one crosses. And they're going to ascend once again on these tracks. So they're going to go up on these. This is in the lateral funiculus. And so either the anterior or posterior spinocerebellar tracks. So they're going to go up here through the spinal cord, up through the brainstem. And so this secondary neuron starts in the gray matter of the spinal cord, goes all the way up, and finally ends in the cerebellum. So this is kind of the exception. It's a 2-neuron chain. So once again, I'm not going to ask you a lot of details about these pathways, but I did want to go through them as good examples to give you some, show you that it is pretty complicated, and you will need to know more if you go into neurology. So here's, once again, kind of a review. So those posterior funiculus, medial, lemniscal pathways, that first one we talked about, are going to be here in the posterior funiculus. The spinocerebellar pathways, anterior and posterior, these are the ones that we talked about last, those 2-neuron chains. They're found here in the lateral funiculus. And then the spinothalamic tracts for the anterolateral pathway are going to be these little light blue ones found in the lateral or anterior tracts or funiculus. So those are all our sensory pathways. Now, we also have these little red motor pathways that we'll talk about. So remember, sensory are ascending. So from the sensory receptors up to the brain. So motor is descending, right? So from the brain down to your skeletal muscles. So motor pathways are going to control effectors such as skeletal muscles. Now, we also have motor pathways that control autonomic things like things that we're not consciously aware of, but we'll talk a little bit more about the autonomic motor nervous system next time. So today we're going to be talking generally about the somatic motor nervous system. And so controlling our skeletal muscles, what we're consciously aware of controlling. So these motor pathways are a little bit simpler in that instead of a 3-neuron chain, they generally only have 2 neurons. And so these 2 neurons are called an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. And these terms are important to know because if you are in neurology and you're talking about spinal cord damage or some sort of hypo or hyperreflexive things, you might hear people say, oh, that's an upper motor neuron sign, that's a lower motor neuron sign. So keep these in mind. It is more clinically relevant than some of the other stuff. So upper motor neurons start in the brain. So they start in the primary motor cortex in that frontal lobe. If it's somatic, or it could be a cerebral nucleus which is one of those deep gray matters, or a brainstem nucleus, and they contact the lower motor neuron. So we're going to talk mostly about the ones that controlling skeletal muscles consciously, and those are going to be in the motor cortex. But they're, you know, as I said, we do have other autonomic things, so they could be in a cerebral nucleus or a brainstem nucleus too. And they contact the lower motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron is wholly within the CNS. So it starts in the brain somewhere, and it's going to go down to the spinal cord. The lower motor neuron is going to be either in the cranial nerve nucleus. So like for our cranial nerves, it might start in the brainstem, but for most of our spinal nerves, it's going to be in the spinal cord. And theirs are going to be in the spinal cord anterior horn if they are somatic motor neurons, or lateral horn if they are autonomic motor neurons. So this is kind of our general example. So the motor pathways start with the upper motor neuron, and the example that we're using is their somatic motor neurons. So the examples that we'll talk about, it's a very general example, are going to be how we control our skeletal muscles. So they start up here in the primary motor cortex, inner frontal lobe. They're going to come down here through our brain, through the spinal cord, and it's going to go all the way down to the level of like whatever spinal nerve you're using. So, you know, if you're moving your arm, it'll go down to the, you know, cervical spinal cord. And then so it's going to go down into the gray matter of the spinal cord. And depending if it's coming out of cranial nerve, it might go down into the brainstem. But we're talking about the spinal cord here, so we'll just imagine that we're going somewhere lower, and we'll go down to a spinal nerve. Now, the lower motor neuron starts in the central nervous system. So it starts in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, because we're talking about somatic motor neurons, and it leaves the anterior or motor root, and then it's going to go to a skeletal muscle, right? So our somatic motor neurons all innervate skeletal muscles, and it always excites the muscle. Remember, when we talked about a motor unit, we said a motor unit was a motor neuron and all the muscle cells it controls. This lower motor neuron is that motor neuron that we were talking about. So that's going to be part of that motor unit. This is the one that's going to be part of the neuromuscular junction, right? It's the one that's going to be releasing acetylcholine into the neuromuscular junction. So we're hopefully connecting this back up to chapter 10. So once again, I'm going to give you an example or two, but they can get a little confusing. So don't worry about the specifics. But remember, the upper motor neuron is wholly within the CNS. So it's going to be all in the brain or the spinal cord. Since we're talking in this example about a somatic motor neuron, so this is a motor neuron that goes to the skeletal muscles and it's conscious, it's going to start up here in the primary motor cortex, in the precentral gyrus. Then it's going to go down through the brain, through the brain stem, and it's going to come down and it's going to descend through these anterior cortical spinal tracts. And it's going to descend here, and it will either cross over here in the brainstem, or it can cross over here in the gray commissure, kind of just depending. There's usually an interneuron, or there may be an interneuron, a very small one, but that's going to be the upper motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is the one that starts right here in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and it goes to the skeletal muscles. So upper motor neurons are wholly within the CNS. Lower motor neurons start in the CNS, which is the gray matter of the spinal cord, and end at the muscles. And so they are going to innervate those axial skeletal muscles, or innervate skeletal muscles. So there are a lot of other, if you look in your book, it goes through the direct pathways and indirect pathways, and it talks about 5 or 6 different pathways. I just wanted to give you one example of an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. As I said, I think for this class, just understanding the basics between sensory and motor pathways are going to be more useful to you. And if you go into neurology later, you can kind of learn these specifics. So we've got a lot of different ones here. These are all going to be your motor tracks. So they're mostly in the anterior and a few in the lateral funiculus of the white matter, these motor pathways. So this is a really good picture, figure, I think 14.12 in your book, and it compares and contrasts sensory and motor tracks. So I really want you to know this, like pretty much everything in this picture. You don't need to know the names of these tracks, but beyond that, I want you guys to know that generally sensory pathways ascend to the brain, so they go up, They usually use three neurons. So the primary sensory neuron, which is going to have the receptor, and it's in the peripheral nervous system. Then the cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion, and it goes up here to the spinal cord. The secondary neuron goes from the spinal cord up to the thalamus, and the tertiary neuron goes from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Now, our motor neurons are going to start with, they have generally a chain of two neurons. They have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is wholly within the CNS, and for these somatic sensory pathways, or excuse me, somatic motor pathways, it starts in the primary motor cortex in the frontal lobe, goes all the way down here, and it's going to synapse in the brainstem or the spinal cord. And then the lower motor neuron is going to leave the central nervous system and go out to the peripheral nervous system and innervate a skeletal muscle. And the lower motor neuron is the one we talked about in chapter 10. It's the one that's releasing acetylcholine into the neuromuscular junction. It's always excitatory. So once again, this is just, this is what I really want you guys to remember. So these slides here. So the primary neuron, secondary, and tertiary, these are kind of the general ones. The cell body is located in the posterior root ganglion for the primary neuron. The primary neuron is the one that's the receptor. The secondary neuron is going to be usually ending in the thalamus, and the tertiary neuron usually goes from the thalamus up to the primary somatosensory cortex. So three in general, because I know the cerebellar tract is a little bit different, but in general we have three, a chain of three for our sensory and a chain of two for our motor pathways. So I know that's a little bit confusing. Hopefully, if you guys watch the Ed Puzzle, it goes over the sensory pathways, kind of an introduction to the sensory pathways. And then the motor pathways are similar. And I just want you guys to know about the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron for motor pathways. All right. You guys, for this part right here, I accidentally didn't take these off. You don't need to know 11, 12, and 13, or 11 and 13. So I want you guys to know the general locations for 10. I want you to know the characteristics 9 and 10 here. We talked about these already. 11, you don't need to know because I told you not to know specific information about those. 12, know about upper versus lower motor neurons, but 13, you don't need to know direct versus indirect motor pathways. So I'll try to edit that. So now the second half, we're going to go over reflexes. So reflexes are going to be important. We have a couple of different types of reflexes. Since this is the spinal cord chapter, we're going to focus on spinal reflexes, but first I'm going to kind of give you an overview of all the different reflexes. So the characteristics of a reflex. Reflexes are rapid, they're pre-programmed. They are something that they're involuntary responses. Usually they involve muscles or glands, and these have evolved in order to help us stay healthy and stay safe. Usually, because it has to be fast, we only have a couple of neurons. Because remember, every time a synapse happens, we have to have there's something called that synaptic delay, right? Because we have to have the neurotransmitters released, they have to diffuse across the gap, then they have to bind to the receptors, then we have to have graded potentials, and then we have to have summation, and then we have to have the action potential, and all of that takes time. So the fewer synapses we have, the faster these reflexes are. Reflexes are pre-programmed, so they always have the same response, and it's going to be a response that's like an evolutionary safety response, right? Something to help you, if you touch fire, your arm you'll pull your hand back. The response is involuntary, and it doesn't involve the brain, and so there's no intent or awareness of the reflex before it happens. You might realize after it happens, but you're if you touch the stove, your arm almost pulls back by itself, right? You don't even have to think about it. It does it by itself. So these are survival mechanisms. So this is a good thing to know. Make sure that you can explain this and label this one. This is a general reflex arc, and we'll talk about a couple others, but a reflex arc is a neural pathway which is responsible for generating the response. This specific example is a spinal reflex because it's happening at the level of the spinal cord. And we're in the spinal cord chapter, so we're talking about spinal reflexes. So we start, let's say you get a nail in your skin somewhere, you step in a nail, or I guess not step because this is your arm, but you get a nail somewhere in your arm or in your finger, you poke it. That's going to be painful. So then we have the sensory neuron here, this stimulus. It's going to send the sensory information up the dorsal horn or dorsal root of the spinal cord to the dorsal horn. And then this purple one is an interneuron. So the interneuron does two things. The first fast thing it does is it's going to directly go to the motor neuron and activate the motor neuron. The motor neuron is then, and the interneuron kind of decides what to do. That's where the pre-programmed response is. It's going to tell the motor neuron what to do. And it's probably going to say, oh, pull your hand back because it hurts. All of this does not require the brain. So this whole thing can happen. The brain is not required. So even if the spinal cord is severed somewhere up here, this reflex could still happen because it doesn't require the brain. It's not going to actually ascend or participate in any of those tracks that we talked about yet for that reflex. But because it's important that you do know what's happening, this interneuron also will send another signal up to the brain. So this collateral, it means it's like a little, another alternate route. It branches, a branching route. So the interneuron will also send this information up through the tracks, through the sensory tracks we talked about, to the brain. So the brain is aware of what happened. But this happens, it takes longer for it to get up to the brain than it does for, this reflex to happen. And so usually the reflex will happen before you're even aware of it. So as I said, I'm going to talk about all different reflexes, and we can classify them in 5 different ways. So first, we have spinal versus cranial reflexes. So spinal reflexes are going to, the reflex center, which is here, is going to be in the spinal cord. And all the reflexes we'll talk about today are spinal reflexes because this is the spinal cord chapter. But we do have a lot of important reflex centers up in the brain stem. And so those, if it's up in the brain stem or in the brain, those are going to be called cranial reflexes. And we'll talk about those more in the next chapter and in some of our 169 chapters. Somatic or visceral reflexes have to do with what the effector is. So if we're moving a skeletal muscle, when we're consciously aware of that, that's going to be a somatic reflex if a skeletal muscle is involved. If it's a visceral reflex, that means we have a gland or a smooth muscle, one of our organs are going to be involved. And so if it's a cardiac muscle, a smooth muscle, or a gland, then it's a visceral reflex. So if we have a reflex where, our heart rate is reflexively getting higher, that's going to be a visceral reflex, right? Because it's affecting our heart or muscle, which is an organ. So think visceral. Monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. So mono means one, poly means many. So monosynaptic is one synapse. Polysynaptic is many synapses. So this is counting how many synapses are in that reflex chain. And so if the sensory neuron directly touches the motor neuron and there are no interneurons, that's called monosynaptic. That means there's only one synapse. Do you think that would be faster or slower than a polysynaptic one? So it's going to be faster. Remember, every synapse we have is going to add a little bit of synaptic delay. So the more synapses you have, sort of the slower that reflex will be. So we want to have just a very few synapses to have a fast reflex. So monosynaptic are faster. Now, ipsilateral or contralateral. We just talked about these words before. What does ipsilateral mean? Ipsilateral means on the same side, and contralateral means on the opposite side. And so are the receptor and effector on the same side? If they are, it's called an ipsilateral reflex. And most of our reflexes, or a lot of them, are ipsilateral because if we put our right hand in the fire, we want our right hand to be pulled out of the fire. We don't necessarily want to put our right hand in the fire and then have our left hand get pulled out of the fire because that wouldn't be as useful. So most of them are ipsilateral, but we will talk about a couple contralateral ones. Contralateral ones are where the receptor and the effector are on opposite sides of the body. And then finally, we have innate versus acquired. And most of our reflexes are going to be kind of innate things that we're born with, but you do kind of acquire and develop some after birth. And so one that I will tell you that you do develop after birth is the menace response. So the menace response, at least puppies do, So I'm going to give you this good example in puppies. The menace response is a response where if something is coming at your eye and you're not it's not you. If something comes at your eye, you will automatically close your eyes if you can see it. And that's going to be something learned. So in veterinary medicine, it's hard to tell if animals can see very well because, you know, we can't ask them, is it blurry? You know, do you need glasses? Can you see out of that eye or not? And so one of the things you can do is you can do the menace response, where you're taking the scary spider and you're putting it towards their eye. And if they can see you, usually they'll, you know, close their eye because they're worried that something is going to poke them in the eye. But young puppies don't have this reflex yet because they don't realize that something coming towards their face could hurt them. So usually it takes a couple months before they kind of have that menace response. So it doesn't mean the young puppy is blind. It just means that they haven't necessarily learned that reflex yet. But most of the ones we'll talk about are more innate, that are just like inborn reflexes. So here's a good example of a monosynaptic reflex versus a polysynaptic. So monosynaptic, we have the sensory neuron that directly touches the motor neurons. There's only one synapse. Whereas polysynaptic has the sensory receptor, then there's a synapse, then there's the interneuron, then there's a second synapse, and then there's the motor. So polysynaptic means that there are more than one synapse, and it usually involves an interneuron. So if we go back here to our example, is this one mono or polysynaptic? It is polysynaptic, right? So we have 1, 2 synapses, so it's polysynaptic. Is this one cranial or spinal? Does it involve the cranial? Does it involve the brain or the spinal cord?
Spinal.
Spinal, right? So this one is spinal. It's involving the spinal cord. Is this one ipsilateral or contralateral? So are the receptor and the effector on the same side or opposite sides?
Ipsilateral.
Ipsilateral, right? They're on the same side, so it's an ipsilateral reflex. And let's see. Is it somatic or visceral? So we have to look at the effector. Is this a somatic effector or a visceral effector?
So it's skeletal, somatic.
Yeah, so it's a skeletal muscle, so it would be a somatic reflex. So this is a somatic reflex. It's a spinal reflex. It is polysynaptic. It is ipsilateral. And then most of these that have to do with like pain and like withdrawal reflexes are going to be innate. So now I'm going to go through, I think we have 4 different reflexes that we'll talk about. And I do want you guys to know the specifics of each of these reflexes. They're not quite as complicated as those spinal pathways. And so these 4 common spinal reflexes are the stretch reflex, the Golgi tendon reflex, the withdrawal reflex, and the cross extensor reflex. And we're going to talk about withdrawal and cross extensor together. And so it's really kind of just like 3. So the first 2, the stretch reflex and the Golgi tendon reflex, rely on proprioceptors. And remember that a proprioceptor is going to be a receptor that's found inside a muscle, a joint, or a tendon that's going to tell your body, like, if your muscles are if your joints are flexed or stretched or flexed or extended, if you have stretch in the tendon or not, what tension is on the muscles. And so this tells your body kind of where your body is in space. And so I want to briefly talk about a muscle spindle. And so a muscle spindle is a proprioceptor that detects stretch in a muscle. And so we're going to talk about this in the stretch reflex. So the stretch reflex relies on this muscle spindle. And when stretched, this muscle spindle sensory axons fire impulses that are conducted to the spinal cord. And so there are some more complicated things about the intrafusal and extrafusal muscle fibers and alpha motor neurons and gamma motor neurons, which are interesting, but as long as you don't go into neurology for this class, I really just want you to know that the muscle spindle is a proprioceptor that detects stretch in the muscle. And when stretched, it's going to send impulses to the spinal cord. And so that's going to be part of the stretch reflex. So the stretch reflex is going to be something that is going to prevent excessive stretch in a muscle, because we don't want our muscle to be stretched so far that it's ripped, right? And we don't want you to start stretching so much that you hurt your muscles. And so the reflex is, if we have excessive stretch in a muscle, if the muscle is being stretched too far, it's going to reflexively contract. So it reflexively shortens to protect that muscle. So the stretch is detected first by those muscle spindle fiber, that proprioceptor. And when stretched, as we said, the muscle spindle is going to fire, and it's going to send impulses to the spinal cord. And it's going to send them up the posterior nerve root right through that posterior nerve root into the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the sensory axon excites the alpha motor neurons of the same muscle, which causes contraction. So this is a monosynaptic reflex, and it's going to excite the same muscle on the same side. So it's an ipsilateral reflex. We'll see a picture of it in just a second. At the same time, right, because this muscle is being stretched, right? And so we want it to then, it's stretched too much, so we want to contract it. So we're flexing this muscle. But in order to flex, let's say it's our biceps, in order to flex our biceps, what does our triceps have to be? If our triceps, if we were stretching it, our triceps was probably contracted. And if we contracted our triceps and our biceps at the same time, we just kind of get this gridlock, right? Like our arm would just be like fighting, our muscles would fight against each other. So what happens is we're going to do two things. One, we're going to cause the biceps to contract, and then we're going to relax the antagonist muscle. So that way it'll let your muscle contract. And this is called reciprocal inhibition. And this part of it is polysynaptic. We'll see a picture. It'll make more sense in a second. And so here's our stretch reflex. So once again, we have our muscle spindle here. And these sensory nerve endings in our muscle spindle are going to detect stretch. When the stretch is detected, it's going to send this signal through this sensory receptor up the posterior horn of the spinal cord, and then it's going to branch and it's going to synapse in the gray matter. So it has two different things it does. The first one is a little bit, probably a little bit faster since it's monosynaptic. It's going to excite the motor neurons of that same muscle. In this case, it's the triceps. So it's opposite of the example I gave you. So it's going to excite the motor neurons of that same muscle that was being stretched. So the muscle is being stretched too much. So now we're going to excite it. So we're going to contract it in order to shorten the muscle and protect it. At the same time, so that our muscles aren't fighting each other, we're going to send this information through an intraneuron, and we're going to inhibit the motor neuron of our antagonist muscle. And so that inhibition is going to cause that muscle to relax, right? So we're turning off, since this neuron here is not, it can't make IPSPs, we're just going to inhibit the whole neuron. We're just going to turn it off. So that means we're stopping acetylcholine from getting to the antagonist muscle. And so that's going to cause it to relax reflexively. So the muscle is stretched too much, and the reflex is then to contract that same muscle and relax the antagonist. And that's called reciprocal inhibition. Now, how do we classify this reflex? So is this reflex cranial or spinal? It's spinal. Is this reflex somatic or visceral?
Somatic.
Somatic. Is this reflex ipsilateral or contralateral?
Ipsilateral.
It's ipsilateral. And then we have two, so the excitatory part here, where we're exciting the same muscle, is monosynaptic, whereas the reciprocal inhibition is polysynaptic. So the stretch result, the stretch reflex itself kind of is monosynaptic, whereas the reciprocal inhibition is polysynaptic. And these are innate reflexes that you're born with. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is the Golgi tendon reflex. And the Golgi tendon reflex is going to be kind of the opposite, where it prevents the muscles from contracting excessively. So like if we're really contracting our muscle a lot. So when we contract our muscle a lot, we put a lot of pressure and a lot of tension on the tendon attached to that muscle, right? And that can strain that tendon. And so as we contract that muscle a lot and we really, put a lot of force against it, especially if we're like trying to pick up something really hard, then we can put too much pressure on that tendon. And so the Golgi tendon organ is a special sensory receptor. It's another one of those sensory receptors we'll talk about that detects excessive tension in a tendon. So as I said, we're like pulling something up and we're contracting it too much. It's putting so much tension on that tendon, and we don't want the tendon to break, right? We don't want to sprain or tear our tendons because they take a long time to heal. And so once again, these are proprioceptors, and they're going to detect excessive tension or stretch in those tendons. So when that happens, they're going to send an information to the spinal cord to tell the spinal cord, oh no, this muscle is contracting too much. It's putting too much tension on this tendon. And so when this happens, so this is our Golgi tendon organ right here. So in this example, we have this muscle, and this muscle is contracting too much. So you're contracting and you're putting too much tension on this tendon. So the Golgi tendon organ here is going to then fire. It says, oh no, there's too much tension. It's going to send the information down here. It's going to go up the dorsal horn, or the dorsal root of the spinal cord, to the dorsal horn. And this is going to then hit an interneuron. And once again, we have two different things happening. So the first one, they both have interneurons this time. So the first one here, remember we said it's contracting excessively. So the first thing it's going to do is relax this muscle here. So then we're going to inhibit that muscle. So we inhibit the muscle that was contracting excessively to cause it to relax. And then at the same time, so we cause it to relax, but we're still kind of in this same area, because just because this muscle is relaxed doesn't mean it's going to lengthen, right? Because we can only sort of actively shorten things. So now at the same time, to kind of lengthen and relax that, we're going to have to activate the antagonist. And when we activate the antagonist, that's going to stretch that muscle out and kind of relax it. And so as we can see, first we're going to inhibit the neurons of the same muscle, so that muscle relaxes. And then we're going to excite the neurons associated with the antagonist muscle. And we call this reciprocal activation. So it's kind of the opposite of reciprocal inhibition that we talked about in the stretch reflex. So now let's categorize this again. Is this cranial or spinal? It's spinal, right? This is the spinal cord lecture. They're all spinal. Is it somatic or visceral?
Somatic.
Somatic too. It's still a skeletal muscle. Is it ipsilateral or contralateral?
Ipsilateral.
It's ipsilateral, so it's on the same side. And is it monosynaptic or polysynaptic?
Polysynaptic.
It's polysynaptic. And so, once again, they're both polysynaptic, the reciprocal activation as well as the Golgi tendon reflex itself. So those are the first two. And now this next one, we're going to talk about the withdrawal and the cross extensor reflex together. So I know we've only got a couple minutes left, but there's not too much time. So this last one is the withdrawal reflex. This is something that you guys have probably all experienced. So it's like where let's say you touch the hot stove and your arm pulls back. So that's the withdrawal. We're withdrawing our appendage from whatever is painful. Or maybe you stepped on something sharp and then your foot pulled back. So that's the withdrawal reflex. And so it pulls a body part away from a painful stimulus. And so the nociceptor means that it is going to, it's something that detects pain. So you have pain detected somewhere. That's going to transmit to the spinal cord, and then it's going to cause, so here's a withdrawal. So we step on a rock. Pain is going to, we detect this pain, and that's going to be sent up here through the spinal cord. And then it's at the same time, we're going to activate these motor neurons to the flexors, to everything that flexes that limb. And it's going to tell all these flexors to flex the leg away or flex the arm away from what's happening. So if you're walking along a beach and you step on, a sharp shell or a sharp rock, you're going to flex that leg away. But what about the other leg? So especially if you're walking, right? And so if we pull one leg away and we pull one leg up, what has to happen to the other leg so we don't fall down? Well, we have to straighten the other leg, right? Because if we were walking, right, and then we stepped down and we didn't really have either leg planted well, when the withdrawal reflex happened, it would cause you to fall over. And that might be dangerous because you might fall on whatever was, pointy, or if you put your foot in something hot and pulled it back and then you fell in the hot water, that would be bad. And so along with the withdrawal reflex, we have something called a cross extensor. So when we feel this painful stimuli, it's the same painful stimuli from the withdrawal reflex. So one thing it does is it activates the flexors of that ipsilateral side on that same limb. And at the same time, it crosses over, that's why it's called the cross extensor, and activates the extensors of the other leg. So that way, when you pull one foot up, the other foot is planted so that you don't fall down. So that's why I said we're going to talk about these together. So we have the withdrawal and the cross extensor. And so the crossed extensor is the only one that we're talking about that is crossing midline. So what type is that? Is it ipsilateral or contralateral?
Contralateral.
Yeah, the crossed extensor reflex is the contralateral reflex. And so the withdrawal reflex is going to be ipsilateral.
Ipsilateral.
So once again, are these spinal or cranial?
Spinal.
They're spinal. Are they monosynaptic or polysynaptic?
Polysynaptic.
They're polysynaptic. Which is the withdrawal ipsilateral or contralateral?
Ipsilateral.
What about the crossed extensor?
That's contralateral.
That's contralateral. And are they somatic or visceral?
Somatic.
They're somatic. So you guys have been able to practice classifying them, just kind of understand these different, the 4 different reflexes. And as I said, the cross extensor and withdrawal, I kind of think of together. So it's almost just like 3 different reflexes. So make sure that you know those and can explain those a little bit. And like what reflex would happen if you stepped on a rock, or what would happen in some of these different things. All right, so that is going to be reflex testing. So clinically, we can test reflexes because we might have neuro problems. So the reflexes can test the function of specific muscles, nerves, and spinal segments. So here, these reflexes, in order for them to work, these muscles all have to work. The neuromuscular junctions all have to work. The spinal nerves they're attached to have to work. And, this part of the spinal cord has to work. Now, we could have, the spinal cord could be severed above here because we don't need the brain, but at least all of these things need to work. So when we test the reflex, we want to see if all of these things are working. If the reflex is diminished or absent, so like, let's say the patellar reflex, right, where they tap your patellar tendon, that's going to be a Golgi tendon reflex, where your, whatchamacallit, it's going to be, I can't remember if it's a stretch or a Golgi tendon reflex. I'm so sorry. It's going to be causing the muscle to stretch, and then it's going to be causing a reflexive contraction of that same muscle. And so if that is active, if it's hyperactive, that means like, so when you hit that patellar reflex, it goes like this, and it's really active. It has an abnormally strong response. That might indicate damage to the brain or the spinal cord. So this is more hyperactive reflexes often indicate damage to the upper motor neuron, whereas hypoactive or absent reflexes might indicate damage to the lower motor neuron or the muscle or the neuromuscular junction. But all of this reflex testing is really complicated, and you'll learn more about it in neuro and as you get to clinical settings. So I think that's about it.